Hello, I'm Donnie Chan, Assistant Curator of Asian Art at the Walters Art Museum. Thank you for joining us for today's talk, which is generally supported by the museum's Friends of Asian Art group. We welcome all of your questions throughout the talk, but please post them in the comments and we will answer them at the end during the Q&A. Now, I am very pleased to introduce today's lecturer, Dr. Sarah-Neel Smith. Dr. Smith is on faculty at the Maryland Institute College of Art, where she teaches in the Department of Art History, Theory, and Criticism. A specialist of late Ottoman and modern Turkish art, Dr. Smith's work focuses more broadly on artistic exchanges between the Islamic world, Europe, and the US from the 19th century to today. Her writing has appeared in Art Journal, Art Margins, Third Text, Bidun, and Frieze. And her first book, Metrics of Modernity, Art and Development in Post-War Turkey, will be published with the University of California Press in 2022. So please join me in welcoming Sarah-Neel Smith.
Thank you, Donnie, for that really lovely introduction. And thank you to the Friends of Asia for this invitation. I've been in the audience for a number of the Friends of Asia talks in the past, so it's especially lovely to get to share some of my work here today. I should also send out thanks here today to the whole Walters team that is working behind the scenes to make this event happen. So thanks also to Chandy Kelly, to Cindy Adamson for logistics and tech support, and for all the other folks that I know had to make the magic happen. You all are the first to hear about the research that I'm going to share here today. I've been working on it here in my home office through the pandemic. And I wanted to invite you today to join me in thinking through some of the research problems that I've been investigating for the last couple of years. So I'll talk today for about 50 to 60 minutes. I'll shift in a moment to sharing some slides, and I'll sort of take you through that research journey that started way back in December 2018 and land at the end of my talk today with some of the bigger questions that I'm sort of brainstorming on now in 2021. So let me share my screen here and get going. In March 1966, the abstract painter Frank Stella sent ripples through the New York art world when he debuted his latest series of paintings at the Leo Castelli Gallery on East 77th Street. 7 gigantic, oddly shaped canvases crowded the walls, their monumental scale pushing the limits of the gallery space with their sharp angles and jutting corners that loomed over visitors and crowded in on viewers. These 7 were just a sampling of a larger 44 painting series that Stella was still working on at the time and that he soon started calling the irregular polygons. The polygons were made up of 4 variations each of 11 distinct compositions, and they circulated quite widely across the US in 1966 and 1967, appearing also at the Guggenheim in New York, at the Corcoran Biennial in DC, and in Toronto, Pasadena, Seattle, and Montreal. They also received extensive press coverage during this period by a number of well-known critics, including the artist Mel Bachner, the critic Barbara Rose, to whom Stella was then married, Michael Fried, then also a close friend of Stella's, and other critics of note, including Dora Ashton, Rosalind Krauss, and Lucy Lepard. Art Forum published no fewer than 3 articles about them and featured one of the polygons as its cover image in November 1966. By 1969, even Vogue was talking about Stella's work as an exhilarating adventure, a slightly more upbeat account than had appeared in Life the year before, which warned its readership that these oddly shaped canvases might prove a challenge. You can sense a bit of discomfort there in that Life headline, but actually it wasn't just more mainstream publications, but members of the art world as well, who were kind of uncomfortable with these paintings. The artist Mel Bachner, for one, wrote rather scathingly that Stella had done away with, quote, all his previous virtues, and had in the polygons replaced symmetry with awkwardness, refinement with raucousness, and strictness with arbitrariness. Bachner's reaction to the polygons actually makes a bit of sense when you think about what Stella had done until that point. Stella had famously debuted at MoMA in 1959 at the age of 23 with the painting Marriage of Reason and Squalor from a series known as the Black Paintings, where he systematically mapped the surface of the canvas using these wide strips of paint and thin stripes of exposed canvas starting from a central axis. So the big modernist insight of these paintings was, of course, that everything on the interior of the painting was deduced from, in some way, the rectangular shape of the canvas itself. Over the next few years, Stella continued to pursue variations on this theme. He started physically removing parts of the canvas's perimeter, or the center, as you can see here in the 1960 painting Avicenna. And by 1966, the curator Lawrence Alloway had come up with a name for this approach. He called it systemic painting, a term referring to the methodical way in which Stella and other artists working in this vein explored painting's own system, canvas and pigment, flatness and depth, etc. These paintings were a big deal in 1959 because they so overtly challenged the lush gesturalism of abstract expressionism, the dominant idiom of the day. And it was pretty widely agreed that Stella had altered the course of modernism with this move, systematizing gesture and requiring the viewer to engage analytically rather than emotively. But now, with the irregular polygons, Stella seemed to have completely abandoned his own system. You can imagine what the experience of seeing these in 1966 might have been like if you'd seen Stella's work before, you were making your way to the Castelli Gallery, maybe sort of mentally preparing yourself for that slightly taxing viewing experience, ready to be analytical. Instead, you see Conway, where color has gone wild. You get these sort of lurid hues like that day-glow pink, that bright red, and shape has also started to act up. The edges of this canvas now elbow their way outward, and in the other polygons they did as well, pushing outward to become pentagons, hexagons, and unnameable shapes. Now, Stella had already started moving in this direction a bit previously in the works you can see here, such as this purple painting here on the left, or Ifafa 2 up here on the right. But even so, the polygons felt somehow more extreme. And Stella also introduced a really important new feature into his system with the polygons, this thick 8-inch wide band that ran around and across the surface of the canvas, very different from the modular or symmetrical band derived from the shape of the canvas that you see here in the purple painting. And bringing through that band a sense really of unprecedented directionality or even force. So you can see here in Conway 1, you have those two bands on the left side of the painting that sort of start in the upper left, drop down, make that sharp right turn, zigzag around its perimeter in this kind of energetic or calligraphic gesture that also holds the whole composition together. So what had provoked those dramatic changes in Stella's work that started showing up in late 1963 and became so extreme by 1966? Where had that band, that calligraphic gesture, that new sense of force come from? None of the critics could really answer that question. So people like Bachner saw this as kind of a personal artistic failing on Stella's part, a kind of regression to the gesturalism and colorism of abstract expressionism. Stella supporters argued, no, he's not going backward. He's still pushing American painting forward. He's just expanding the system in new ways. He's systematizing gesture. But nobody could really explain the source of these changes, aside from suggesting there was some kind of inherent artistic intuition on Stella's part. Today, I want to suggest that those changes weren't just a product of the artist's imagination, but came from a very concrete experience that Stella had about a year and a half earlier, in the fall of 1963, when he took an international trip with his close friend, Henry Geldzahler, the curator of contemporary art at the Met, and the wealthy collectors Shirley and Stanley Woodward. It was a formative trip for Stella, who was then only 27 and not particularly well-traveled, and an event that the artist described later in life as, quote, a very big experience for me. It was also a well-documented trip whose traces can be found at major archives in LA, New Haven, and DC, but also, rather strangely, it's a trip that most Stella scholars have chosen to ignore. And of course, you know what is coming here. In the fall of 1963, Frank Stella went to Iran. Stella's visit to Iran was, to be fair, somewhat coincidental. It was actually Geldzahler, who'd been invited by the Woodwards to travel with them through Iran. He was helping them build a collection of contemporary art that would be used to decorate American embassies, and he in turn invited his friend Stella along for the ride so the artist could connect with a potential patron. The four travelers covered a lot of ground, by plane, by car, seeking out the great monuments of Iran's past. And I've flagged here on the map just some of the locations I've been able to confirm that they went to. You can see they were often traveling 500 or 600 miles in between. They also took over 300 photographs together. So you see Shirley Woodward here at ancient Persepolis, famously burned by Alexander the Great in 330 BC. Looking hot and tired in Isfahan, the 16th century seat of the Safavid dynasty and Iran's top tourist destination at the time. And on the side of a dusty road somewhere outside of Kerman. In one of my favorite snapshots taken at the Shah Mosque in Isfahan, you see Geldzahler and Woodward striding towards the camera looking quite elegant. Stella, on the other hand, always has a little bit more of a casual look in his loose rumpled shirt, sunglasses, and a big grin. This trip, of course, was made possible in the first place by the dramatic extension of American power into Iran after World War II. The US, driven by the pursuit of oil, but also by Cold War concerns, as Iran bordered Russia and the US saw it as a strategic buffer against communism. And I think this life cover here from 1951 really reflects the prominence of Iran in the American imagination by that point in time. Of course, the US's involvement only increased after the CIA aided the 1953 overthrow of the prime minister, whom they replaced with the Shah. And you see here an image from life here, rather disingenuously attributing conflict and blood in Iran to confusion rather than to these political machinations. Events that led a decade later in 1963, just a few months before Stella made his trip there, to protests against the recent arrest of the rising opposition leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, foreshadowing the revolution of 1979. Stella and Geldzahler and the Woodwards benefited from and participated in this American expansionism in Iran. They were welcomed by a vast community of Americans on the ground. Without a word of Farsi, without much knowledge of the history and culture, they could move around with ease, that unique confidence that comes with the financial backing of the American dollar. Today, I want to argue that the changes in Stella's work that the critics noticed but could not explain were a direct result of that trip. I'm certainly not the first researcher to note the importance of Islamic art to Stella, and actually the artist himself stated that that trip informed one of his most famous painting series, this group of gigantic arc-shaped paintings called the Protractors that he made in 1967, between 1967 and 1971. But there's surprisingly little detailed research on this topic, just vague descriptions of Stella's quote-unquote fascination with Islamic art or experience in Iran. But if you just look at the evidence from Stella's trip, it tells a really different art historical story, pointing away from the protractors and towards the more angular polygons. And today I want to argue more specifically that Stella derived that running band, that really crucial new compositional device that you see in the polygons, from a specific monument called Sultania. Sultania is a massive octagonal 14th century tomb located in northwest Iran. It was built by the Ilkhanid ruler Urgeitu to house his body after his death, and is particularly famous for its decorative program, both on its inside and on the exterior of its pointed dome. That dome is encased in a layer of shimmering turquoise tiles and encircled at its base by a ribbon of calligraphic brickwork containing 3 holy names: Allah, or God, Muhammad, the Muslim prophet, and Ali, a central figure in the Shiite tradition. Now you can actually get up on the roof, and the travelers did that close enough to reach out and touch that script and see it from very, very close up. So they were able to observe it and to photograph it also from quite nearby. The script there on the outside of the dome is written in an angular script known as shatranji, or rectangular Kufi, which translates the curvilinear lines of written script into right angles. At Sultania, some of the letters are also rotated 45 degrees to fit into the diamond shape that's the main decorative form. So you can see here, first, the Aleph on the right is tilted 45 degrees to the left, top over bottom from that standard vertical axis of the script. Next, the remaining 3 letters, the lams and the he, which are all linked together, drop below the horizon line and rotate also 45 degrees left, but this time the bottom sweeps around first to sort of nestle in there into the bottom of the diamond. So you still very much have the word Allah at work there. That rotation affects neither legibility nor meaning, but it's now able to fit into the larger decorative pattern of the architectural monument as a whole. I first realized that Sultania mattered to Stella. I was at the Smithsonian a couple of years ago now, in December 2018. I knew Stella had gone to Iran, and I was just flipping through his papers at the Archives of American Art. I wasn't expecting too much, and I certainly wasn't expecting too much out of this folder, in part because it was slightly misdated to 1965. But I opened it up, and there at the bottom is this tiny little notebook, kind of clearly designed to fit in your pocket, use it on the go, and that's exactly what Stella did. I started to flip through this and saw for several pages are notes on new paintings, which is what Stella called the irregular polygons at this juncture. It also includes his early designs for the polygon compositions, as well as further notes on color and shape and art historical references. And then 7 pages in, I hit this page, very, very prominently headed Sultania, and including several notes about that monument. So you see at the bottom, he's first done a small sketch of these 3 nested V's pointing upward and to the right. And then he's noted first the, quote, 3 repeating figures on the dome, so those 3 holy names, as well as the way that glazed tile alternates with buff-colored unfinished brick on the monument itself. So a number of things were going through my mind at that moment. First, great, I am not crazy. I always thought there was more of a connection to Iran than anyone said, and this really seemed to back that up. The second thing I was thinking was, wow, that looks exactly like the paintings he did right after he got back from Iran, known as the notched V's. And I think we can pretty confidently say that Sultania is a source of that form that was intensely generative for him through the 1960s. You can see him here moving from that little 1-inch wide sketch to these massive 10, 11, 12 foot long paintings that replicate directly the scale of the Sultania's decoration. This form also became important for him later in the 60s in a series of lithographs that he named Star of Persia, like this one that you see here. So I started chipping away at that angle of research, and then a year later, in November 2019, I had another archival find, which was all of the photos from the trip, which are held at the Beinecke Library at Yale. There are about 300 of them. The photos also place the same emphasis on Sultania. You can see this one here is a close-up that Stella took. I did not crop that. That's how close they were able to get to the bricks themselves, really zooming in and focusing down to the scale of the individual brick so you can see the details of the glazed tile versus the unglazed tile with great proximity. What I want to emphasize here is that Stella encountered plenty of curvilinear architectural ornament on this trip. It was absolutely everywhere. I'm showing some images of the more curvilinear ornament at the Great Mosque of Isfahan that he also saw and photographed, but his modernist eye, I think, really zeroed in on that geometric epigraphic program at the dome's base. Some of the photos that he took seem to have been taken with the intention almost of stitching them together, as if he could replicate that band running around the dome in its separate pieces. And they had the film developed there while still in Iran, and he sent several prints of them back to his then wife, the art critic, Barbara Rose. So together, the sketches and the photos told me two things. First, we know Stella first started thinking about the polygons in Iran. And second, of the many Iranian Islamic structures he encountered on the trip, Sultania really mattered. So we have to think these through two things together. Let me give a quick example of what I mean here. Take a look at this comparison between the Allah motif on Sultania and the irregular polygon titled Sanbornville. There are a lot of visual similarities here. The right edge of both forms is outlined by that band that's been tilted 30 to 45 degrees to the left from the standard vertical axis. At Sultania, it's been tilted from that standard vertical of the text. In the painting, it's been tilted from that standard vertical of the edge of the canvas. Both forms are also closed up in the same way by that band that runs around the bottom and the leftmost side, while leaving the upper edge open here. In the painting, it's almost as if that pale yellow paint can flow over the edge of the canvas, similarly to the way that that buff brick has to retain its flow in order to continue the movement of the pattern. And the band shares a common purpose in the interiors of these forms as well. So in both, you see these interlocking bands of different colors, but equal width, binding together the larger unit to produce a sense of surface tension and unity across the whole, while still continuing to emphasize this sense of directionality and tilt. They're even quite close in physical scale. Stella's band is 8 inches wide to Sultania's 10. So you've got enclosure and interlock, directionality and tilt. All of these features of Stella's painting are achieved through that compositional device of the running band. I think he recognized in Sultania a kind of kindred artistic practice, foreign but also familiar approach to the band, similar to the one he'd been working with already, but that was not dependent on the rectangular canvas and was instead coming out of architecture, calligraphy, and the related features of directionality, dimensionality, and scale. Okay, so it took me a couple of years to figure that out. That was the sort of 2-year research journey of 2018, 2019, as I put those pieces together, figured out what mattered to Stella at this moment in his career between 1963 to 1966. I'll shift now to look more closely at that notebook and the individual sketches in more depth. But before I do, I want to just pause briefly on the titles, because you may have been wondering about those. So these 11 paintings are named after a series of towns in New Hampshire, a place that Stella had spent time as a child on family vacations. And when I first started researching these, I was having some difficulty squaring the New Hampshire titles with all of my theories about Iran, until I realized that the artist actually quite frequently titled paintings after places he'd visited in the past. So in 1963, for example, he made a whole series of paintings he named after cities in Florida, where he'd gone in 1961. And he actually played around with the possibility of naming the polygons after towns in either Iran or Poland as late as 1965. Now, that kind of recursive, sort of looping, self-referential approach means you can't really assume an easy one-to-one relationship between the artwork and a given place, but it does tell us something else of relevance here. It tells us that visual experiences that Stella had accrued in a given place continue to germinate in his mind, filtering down through the years to resurface in later work. The primary means through which Stella synthesized those past visual experiences over time was through drawing. And we know this because in 1966, when he was in the middle of painting the polygons, Stella gave an extensive interview to the TV station WNET, where he explained that drawing process in detail. So if we kind of cross-reference Stella's explanation of his drawing process with the actual drawings he did in Iran and afterward, we can start to trace in a kind of chain of visual connections how he got from Sultania to Sanbornville. During the first phase, Stella told his interviewer, quote, "I make a lot of diagrams and I fool around with a lot of ideas." And I think that's exactly what we see going on in the Iran notebook. This notebook contains 10 sketches, an inch or two wide, that represent some of the artist's earliest ideas for the irregular polygons. And the order in which these drawings proceed also seem to indicate that his visit to Sultania really catalyzed Stella's sketching process in that series and stimulated him to introduce the band into his repertoire. So Stella was already thinking about how to build a painting out of irregular geometric forms before he went to Sultania. You can see in this sketch here, he's got these forms that are fitting together sort of like puzzle pieces. He's labeled each one with a different letter to indicate its fill color. So white for, W for white, O for orange, etc. And then the Sultania sketch comes, and he's kind of off and running. You see that Sultania V appearing just a couple sketches later. It's been sort of flipped over, pointing down now, and now it's been integrated into a larger composition as a whole. That seems in turn to lead to a really more in-depth investigation of the band as a mechanism, the way it can turn corners or articulate a right angle, as you can see here. And by the end of the sequence, that Sultania V has become a single form that is, you can tell, been quite quickly integrated and forms the foundation in many ways of this final compositional sketch. You might notice too that his line here gets faster and more confident, going from that kind of sketchy and tentative line early on to the sort of speedy, hasty line at the very end. Within just 9 sketches, then, the Sultania V transforms into Stella's band. It's a new form. It's capable of turning corners. It can navigate oblique as well as right angles. It can interlock as well as outline. It can move inside as well as around a given arrangement. From Sultania on out, the band is quite literally part of the picture. After his first experimental phase of drawing, Stella usually moved on to a second phase, so he could look at a composition on the page, sort of like you would look at a painting on the wall. That's how he described it. Stella made this particular sketch on the back of a discarded press release, and it picks up where the Iran notebook left off. You can see that the band is really now fully integral to Stella's system. Here it kind of enables him to interlock the many parts of a branching composition. It holds together that top-heavy arrangement even when it starts to open up or its arms start to split away from one another. Those of you with a keen eye might also have noticed that the sketch carries the working title Yazd. This is a misspelling of Yazd, one of the cities that Stella visited in Iran, and indicates that the trip really remained central to the artist's thinking as he continued to solidify his ideas for the polygons. Finally, a graph paper sketch here from 1965 or 1966 represents that third and final phase as Stella described it. This one here is for the painting Effingham, though Stella, you can see, has not yet merged the double band that runs along the base of the sketch into the single band that you see in the final painting. But you can get a sense from this image of the way that the artist translated at this juncture these freehand forms into more measured squares, carefully calculating those angles and the precise sizes of its different forms. Those graph paper drawings served two purposes. First, the artist would use them to send off to the company that custom built his canvases. But he also used them in the studio, where you can see he deployed a yardstick and an extra long pencil to transfer those graph paper drawings onto the canvases while they lay on the floor. From there, the actual painting of the series unfolded quite rapidly as he marked off its different parts with a thin strip of masking tape, selected his paint colors, and began applying paint with a wide house painter's brush, filling in all of its fields. You can see him here almost finishing the painting Ossipee, and he kind of walks away from it at the end of the film with an air of satisfaction. So the film and Stella's drawings tell us a lot about that iterative, multi-year drawing process through which Stella slowly integrated the band into his system of painting. So I'll switch now to the paintings themselves for another 10 to 15 minutes, and that'll sort of take me into the end of my talk here, where I raise a few different possibilities for how we can start to analyze them in relation to Iran. Once I'd kind of landed on the polygons, I'd realized, okay, this is where the meaningful connection lies. It actually was a bit of a challenge for me to simply describe the nature of their relationship to the Ilkhanid mausoleum in the most basic sense. Because if you look at these, in some of these, the relationship to the architecture is quite close, but in others, it's quite attenuated. Keep in mind, there were 4 each of 11 compositions, 44 canvases at all, and they just didn't all stick as closely to the Islamic source material. There were, for examples, polygons like Wolfboro, much less about flatness and calligraphic line, and very overtly evoking space, maybe a public square, a facade. How can we then analyze these paintings in relationship to the monument, given that the visual connections between them are often quite tenuous? I started out looking for other examples in art history, reference points. So I thought, okay, Matisse, right? There's a lot of wonderful scholarship, particularly by Roger Benjamin on Matisse's, quote, modernist Orientalism, right? An early example of an artist drawing a direct analogy between the flat plains of North African architecture and the flat surface of the abstract canvas. Then I thought pattern and decoration movement, the much more intentionally overt forms of cultural borrowing in Stella's immediate community in New York in the early 1970s, when artists like Joyce Kozlov, affiliated with that movement, lifted Islamic architectural decoration wholesale in the name of a kind of activist project to help revive the so-called minor arts. I think these are art historical siblings or maybe distant cousins of the irregular polygons, but the analytical terms that art historians have developed to discuss these types of artworks tend to privilege these more overt visual connections, right? Those sort of loud forms of citation or appropriation. But it doesn't always provide a way to talk about the more quietistic, sometimes almost subterranean ways that Stella's paintings make use of an Islamic source. So I want to turn instead to the field of literature to think about these paintings and borrow an analytical approach that was developed by Edward Said, a name probably familiar to many of you as the author of the 1978 book Orientalism, but who in his slightly later book, Culture and Imperialism, developed a method of literary analysis that he called contrapuntal reading. That's what I want to do during the rest of my time here today. Contrapuntal reading views the artwork as an arrangement of counterpoints, like multiple voices in a polyphonic musical arrangement, which both compete and harmonize at the same time. Said, in a really wonderful essay that I can't recommend highly enough, demonstrated this method in this kind of virtuosic rereading of Jane Austen's novel Mansfield Park, in which he goes through and points to a handful of very light, very passing references to the colonial sugar plantation in Antigua that's owned by the Lord of Mansfield Park, and whose profits financially sustain the British household that is the novel's primary subject. Said's point is that although these references or counterpoints are quite fleeting, they're actually essential to the larger world and the plot of the novel. And they mean that that imperial periphery of the British Empire is structurally a core part of Austen's book. Now, Said, being Said, he also manages to show how these kinds of imperial concerns are actually significant to the entire British literary tradition. And I may not go that far today, but I do want to do something similar with Stella's paintings. I want to look, like Said, at a canonical work of Western modernism and recover that trace evidence, those small details within the paintings that reflect the artist's engagement with an Iranian Islamic tradition that was considered peripheral or even extra canonical within standard histories of art at the time. I'll look at just 3 or 4 of the polygons using the method. These two bear very clear visual echoes of specific forms at Sultania. In fact, Conway and Sanbornville both replicate a grouping of Arabic letter forms that are also one of the most common and the most significant letter groupings in an Islamic tradition. Look again at that Allah motif from Sultania that consists of the rotated versions of the 4 letters, an Aleph and 2 lams as the vertical letters, and the letter He, that sort of final square with a tail. That particular grouping is immediately legible, even to the novice reader of Arabic, as the word Allah, and it appeared all over the place in Iranian Islamic architecture. You might, by this point, find yourself able to pick it out here, where it recurs many times in this panel from the Great Mosque of Isfahan, a panel that actually Stella also saw and photographed. This set of letters, I want to emphasize, functions as a visual unit. It stamps itself on your eye in an instant. It doesn't require piecing together or sounding out the way a long word or phrase might. And that exact grouping of letter forms also structure these paintings. It becomes especially noticeable if you read them from right to left, like Arabic script, instead of left to right. Both contain those elif and lam-like verticals on the right and the left. Both also center on that enclosed quadrilateral that forms the letter he. There are differences in the order, right? In Conway, the vertical and quadrilateral have swapped places, but the basic unit is the same. It's this iconic grouping that make up the same word. I don't think Stella intended to refer explicitly back to Islamic epigraphy here, right? Citation and reference and appropriation, those are not part of his artistic project at that moment. In fact, his model of abstraction in the 60s is all about the autonomy of the painting as an object and a medium. I think what we're seeing here is an instance of remembered form, a visual unit seen by the artist, but not read, right? The fact that he couldn't read these words meant, I think, that he retained them as purely visual form, cached in his memory, internalized, synthesized and diffused through that months-long process of drawing until they appeared again, but now as what he called a, quote, method of organization for his own modernist paintings. So you end up with an Islamic counterpoint embedded within the paintings, the residual traces of the artist's encounter with Sultania in the objects themselves. So what of those less overt examples, those instances where the paintings don't quite replicate those visual units in the same way? Sunapi, for example, does all sorts of things. It's got that calligraphic band. It also sort of resembles a ground plan. There are moments, too, where it creates the illusion of recession and three-dimensional space. But I still think there's a really important connection here that you can get at if you compare the way that both Sultania and Stella's paintings work as systems for regulating gesture. Systems that translate gesture into a geometric form while still retaining certain key features of it, like energy or directionality or force. At Sultania, scriptural gesture was squared off. It was made rectangular, translated into brick, all processes which removed it from its association with the hand. But at the same time, it retained that sense of right to left movement associated with script. It simply rerouted those energies into another higher purpose, that purely visual energy of pattern. And that's exactly how Stella used the band in his paintings. Sunapi, too, places that same emphasis on what Stella called direction and force. The eye kind of irresistibly traces that light turquoise band from that upper right as it drops. It makes that hard left turn, and then it rounds 6 corners, coming finally to edge along the left and the bottom of the painting. And as you trace it with the eye, you get a sense of the gesture of tracing with the hand. That experience of, I think, kind of outlining or tracing is then repeated again at its interior in that enclosed polygonal form. In 1965, Stella said of the polygons, "I didn't want to retain that old modular format anymore. I wanted to go back to an area of gesture or an area of picture making that had more room." He was, in other words, reintroducing gesture, but regulating it, right? He was returning to that feature associated with abstract expressionism, but in a controlled, systematic way. And I think he saw in Sultania an alternative form of gesture to that of abstract expressionism, one that enabled him to expand his system, push modernist painting forward, but without using an expressionist mark that would have been seen as regression. Right? So at Sultania, in other words, gesture is sort of regulated through that rectangular kufi in the name of architectural decoration. And in the polygons, Stella draws on that strategy, not in order to cite it or appropriate it, or to signal affiliation with Islamic art, but to use it for his own modernist ends. My final example, this is one of a number of polygons where Stella reintroduced spatial depth. You can see that orange trapezoid at the base really instantly signals recession in space, that turquoise form, a flat wall or perhaps two meeting at right angles in a corner. And it brings back into the viewing experience the impulse to identify form, right? A public square, a building, or to feel your own body in relationship to that imagined space, bringing back in exactly those dimensions that Stella had previously expelled from his work and connecting the painting quite significantly to architecture. But at the same time, and this is something that all of the critics in the 60s were very, very interested in, Stella used that band, that orange band, that magenta band, to remind you one more time that this is still a flat painting. That orange band, for example, it really brings back to the surface your eye, sort of similarly to the way that that buff-colored brick emphasizes the flatness and the surface in the name of architectural pattern. In other words, the Islamic counterpoint here is not an individual motif, but rather a specific way of regulating gesture or regulating spatial depth. Okay, so let me wrap up here in my last few minutes by zooming out again, stepping back a bit from those formal features of the architecture and the paintings to think more about that expanded context in which we can now start, I think, to reread the irregular polygons. If, as I'm arguing here, these paintings have a meaningful connection to Iranian Islamic art, then that opens up a number of different ways that we could reread them. And I'll just mention a few here. First, if we really account for the ways in which Stella's trip was part of the expansion of American interests in Iran in the 50s and 60s, we might read the very quietude of his references to Iranian Islamic architecture as a crucial part of their historical significance, revealing the position of power from which Stella approached the act of study and synthesis of this tradition, right? In the very aesthetic characteristics of the paintings themselves, they show Stella to be participating in this broader American approach to Iran and Iranian culture as eminently available to the United States, at their disposal for access, for consumption, for use. And if we want to read that back into the paintings, we could say that Stella's borrowing and transposition of the Ilkhanid line into the heart of American modernism is a kind of refiguring of that extension of American political power in painted form. But we could also think about how these paintings connected to an extensive American visual culture, which displayed very specific visual templates to represent Iran and kind of more mainstream culture, and a visual culture that Stella's own work was part of. I cannot tell you what a mind-blowing experience it was to turn the page from this feature on Stella in Vogue in December 1969 to the following page featuring the Shah Banu, the Empress of Iran, wearing a dress, we are told, like that worn by women in the south of Persia, quote unquote, and participating in this same visual signaling of Iran-born Persia through those angular forms of geometric abstraction. Even more mind-boggling is what happens 2 pages later, which is a 20-page sequence of American models, including a young Lauren Hutton, although this is not her here, atop mosque domes in Isfahan and various other cities in Iran, which I think offers another visual framework in which to see these paintings. We might start to see them in light of this broader concept of Persian blue, right? The densely saturated meaning given to color as a metonym for Persia. Here it's particularly the turquoises and that deep blue that is made to be a marker of all things Iran, and that extended not just through fashion, but also across the travel industry. You can see here a poster from the early 1960s, a guidebook here featuring Sultania on the cover, and also trafficking in this visual language of Persian blue, that I think we could start to imagine Stella's paintings within as well. The polygons are, of course, New York paintings. And if we come at them that way, we can think of them as a response to the looming presence of abstract expressionism. We could think of them in terms of the different periods of Stella's own work, representing a shift to the concerns of architecture in the early 60s. But they're not just New York paintings. They're also Iran paintings, shaped in an essential way by the presence of an Islamic counterpoint that we have to account for if we're to fully understand them in the historical moment of their making. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah-Neel. And please, that was a fascinating topic. And we've got some excellent questions. So Bev Biderman, apologies if I mispronounced your name. He asks, was there any relationship to commercial graphic design of that period?
I don't know yet, but my hypothesis would be yes. Even just given the sort of common visual language that we see, even just across those travel posters or other advertisement more generally. So honestly, folks in the audience may know more about the commercial graphic design angle than I do at this point. So, don't hesitate to reach out if you do. But my tentative answer would be, I would assume so, yes.
Great. And Alex Segerman asks, is there any, I think you sort of touched upon this, is there any evidence that Stella knew what the Sultania calligraphy said, or was it just purely shapes and visuals for him?
I don't have evidence that he knew what it said. I think that probably even if he had sort of been told what the letter forms were and walked through that, that he would have sort of seized upon it as visual form. I think I called it sort of as purely visual form. And I think one of the reasons that was likely to happen is because that's part of what the original calligraphy was designed to do. It was designed to function as a legible unit of text, but also something that you could grasp in a moment without having to break it down into separate sort of explicitly textual forms. So just looking back at our question here, my impulse is he may have known what the content was, but he was not having the experience of reading.
Mm-hmm. And George Siskel asks, did Michael Fried and or Stella's wife, Barbara Rose, ever reference Stella's applied research for this body of work? Like aside from in his journal entries, for example, or in any other archival material?
Do you mean did Fried or Rose ever reference the Iran element? So you've hit on the missing puzzle piece right there, and I'll tell you why it's missing. Stella's letters to Barbara Rose about this experience have been in lockdown during the pandemic for the last 10 months. And I only found out about them on March 1 last year. George, I don't know if Barbara Rose, or certainly I don't think Michael Fried referenced this. My hope and hunch is that Stella and Rose had a dialogue about that, but more informally in correspondence.
So Rebecca Trefilova asks, can you comment on Stella's color choices? Because you had described some of them as almost lurid.
Yeah, the color dimension can go so many different ways. Lurid, I should have emphasized, was a quote from Stella himself. So that was a term that he used to describe his colors from the purple paintings, that early hexagonal one I showed on, as well as the polygons. I think we could come at the color from all sorts of ways. In the polygons, the big change that he made was to use those really, really vibrant day glow colors alongside more matte epoxy enamels. So it was a very, very strong contrast, not just in terms of how it appeared to the eye, but in the actual physical makeup of the pigment and therefore of the color effect. He also expanded, as you saw, into those like turquoises and pinks and bright yellows. I've thought about this. I think you can think about this from the angle of the way that color was gendered in the New York art world. So if we were to think about these paintings, say after in the wake of Helen Frankenthaler, as opposed to in the wake of Jackson Pollock, I think we could think about their connection to decoration and discourses around paint and the gendering of color. Here, I also am picking up a lot, and of course, I'm highlighting the ones in which he was using a color palette that I saw as relating to the Iranian material in particular. But across the 44 paintings, you know, they're not all turquoise and blue. It's a very, 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 very wide palette.
So Timothy Atkinson asks, how do you think the interior depth and shadows of the interiors of Islamic architecture relate to Stella's final products?
Yes. that is the next talk. Wow, these questions are so good. I think that, and I sort of tried to gesture at this a little bit at the end, I think another way to think about the polygons is as a shift from the concerns of painting to a shift towards concerns with architecture. And I think that may have come directly out of this experience of spending time in these massive monumental, these massive monuments in Iran. You're asking specifically, I'm looking here on the screen, about interior depth and shadows. My impulse is to say that in those works, such as the last one I showed, that I think in some ways was simultaneously about a flat painting surface and resembled a ground plan in some ways, and also resembled a space that you could enter into. I think we could identify depth and shadows and architectural elements in a lot of these paintings just within this series.
Mm. Yeah, and another question related to painting is Nisa Ari asking, have you found any connections between Stella looking at or interested in Timurid or Safavid painting?
I have not. I will say I know that that was actually a major reference point for some of the pattern and decoration artists later in the 70s. And that was painting that they were able to encounter through the incredible collections shown at the Met in New York. Mm. So the question of Stella's engagement with something like manuscript painting or the sort of smaller formats, I have no evidence of that whatsoever.
I'm just getting a lot of questions, but one question that I had when looking at all of the black and white photos of the trip and then later of Stella's painting and the video, who were they? Who was photographing?
So the first photos that I showed of Stella's paintings were just installation shots from the Leo Castelli Gallery in 1966. And that was a kind of standard practice to photograph all of the exhibitions they had for the gallery records. So the Castelli Gallery in particular is a major important source for installation shots of artists from that period. Mm-hmm. what was the second? Oh, who was the film stills that I pulled? Those were just film stills from the interview filmed by WNET, and that was part of an interview that he did with the curator Alan Solomon. It's actually an interview that and a film that you can find online. It's available on YouTube and on archive.org. And I will also say it's an interview that is often cited quite widely in the scholarship on his work as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have today for today's talk. So I especially want to thank Sarah-Neel for joining us today. And thank you all for tuning in. Please be sure to check out our website for more excellent and great programming like this. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks so much, Donnie.